Hi everybody and welcome to another episode of Historia Politica Publica. In the episode of today I'm going to talk about The Wretch of the Earth, the book written by Frantz Fanon and published in 1961. Frantz Fanon, I have made another episode about him. He was a psychoanalyst. He was born in Martinica in 1925. That at the time was part of the French Empire. He fought against the Nazi army with the French army, and after that he went to Lyon in France, and later on he established himself in Algeria, where he works as a psychoanalyst. And precisely he wrote an incredible book which is called Black Skin, White Masks, published I think in 1956, in which he established this comparison between the white people and the black people. He speaks about racism, how the racist ideas are inherent in any society since they are child. He gives a lot of examples. For one very easy to catch is that he explains how when he was growing up, in all the graphic novels and in the comics, in the books, the hero was depicted as the figure of the white male, whereas the villain was this kind of black unknown people. Many times they didn't have even a name. So with this context, I'm going to talk about his idea of decolonization, the historical context in which he was writing and living in Algeria, a time where it was the Algerian War of Independence that started in 1954, and why for him this idea of colonialism must be eradicated through violence, even though it doesn't have to be an aggressive violence, but it could be a symbolic violence. So he gives emphasis to the idea of violence as a means of liberation, because for him the idea of violence gives the oppressed people a sense of agency, and it seems utopic to deal with the colonizers through dialectic arguments. This is something that he witnessed in Algeria, also in Martinique, how the colonizer had arrived to an unknown land, had made their homes there, and have they imposed their structures. So if they were able to leave the country intact by peaceful means, it would be great. But Fanon is more realistic, and he realizes that only through a common unity between the colonized people, which are bigger in numbers always than the settlers, it will be possible to join and accomplish the liberation. So in that sense, the idea of uniting people, it has connotations with nationalism as a kind of imaginary, as a kind of myth, in order to get the final aim, which will be to get free from the settlers. In that sense, for Fanon, decolonization will serve to create a new humanism which will be born after the emancipation. So for him, it's not to imitate the European ideals, but rather to create a new structure of people, trying also to maybe get some ideas that can be achievable, can be worthy from other areas of the world, but not to imitate the Europeans. And he will be very critical about the bourgeoisie and the elites in the colony, which will try to ally with themselves. For that reason, he believes that in the post-colonial state, democracy and the popular will be first, driving programs of social and economic change that cross national borders. Henceforth, he rejects the replacement of colonial administrator by, as he called it, national middle class who will keep exploiting the people. In that sense, for him, everyday life encouraged the development of aesthetic frames of mind, and he explores him very well in Black Skin, White Masks, in which he put this idea of the microactivities as essential to create an ideology which seems invisible, but it is that one that directs society toward different means, and in this case, racism. He theorized the idea of the master and slave created by Hegel, in which the blacks see themselves are oppressed as slaves, and the white are the masters, and looking to the black people, they reinforce their idea to have legitimacy over them. Henceforth, race as a category based on color is a product of the lived experience and all this theory that the white masters have created in order to legitimize their dominion towards the black people. As he refers, and also the political theorist Quays Appiah, who had written extensively about that and has put all his ideas in the book The Lies That Bind, they agree that blackness and whiteness are not natural categories of human identity, but are constructed by the interplay of social relations, of coercion and domination during many years. We have the cases of India, Algeria, in Morocco, in Indochina, also in Cuba. For that reason, the decolonization process in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, it is fundamental to comprehend the framework in which Frantz Fanon was creating his theory. Therefore, the construction of racial identities that contest the racial worldview of the colonizers is something that has been built through many decades of oppression and exploitation. Henceforth, the key is not assimilation but the formation of a distinct and independent entity that eschews dependence on the white colonizer after many years of exploitation. For that reason, he makes a comparison, an analogy between the colonialism and exploitation, and also a difference with the separatist movement. For him, colonialism, what it does, it's alienated the people in the area. And on the other hand, violence as a means of emancipation is inclusive and national as it joins the people against the common enemy. And as he remarks in the book, The Great of the Earth, even if the armed struggle has been symbolic and the nation is demobilized through a rapid movement of decolonization, the people reckon that the liberation has been the business of each. This we can see that one of the best examples of that idea that Fanon portrays, it was the Carnage Revolution in Portugal in 1974, in which different spheres of society, like the masses of people, members from the Communist Party, the Socialist Party, and even the militaries, they allied themselves to overthrow the dictatorship. And they believe that in the imaginary, that all of them had a fundamental role in the overthrow of the dictatorship that was in Portugal, governing for over 50 years, if I am not wrong. 40 years, it was between 45 and 50 years. Although Frantz Fanon didn't live enough to see the Carnage Revolution which happened in 1974 because he died in 1961, just months later, to publish this masterpiece, The Great of the Earth, probably that was an idea of how a symbolic violence can still unite the people in order to accomplish an end that will benefit the majority of the population. So, as I mentioned, this was a context of the 1960s. He published his first book, Black Skin, White Mask, 1956. A Day in Colonialism, it was, I think, 1958. Day in Colonialism, it was based in his experience in Algeria. Yes, it was in 1959, I think, because it was during the 5th year of the Algerian War of Independence, and he portrayed the struggles that were happening there. So that was the context of the Battle of Algiers that happened in 1956. A moment in which the French army decided to crush by sheer force the Algerian rebels. There is a movie by Gillo Pontecorvo which is called The Battle of Algiers, which portrayed perfectly the actions taken both by the National Liberation Front, which was the main arm of the Algerian independence, and the French army, with the arrival of General Masu and the other paramilitaries. You have in that year the Cuban Revolution that started in 1956 and finished in 1959, with the independence of the country and the expulsion of the United States. I mean, in theory, Cuba was independent since 1898 when the United States take Cuba from the Spanish Empire. However, in realistic terms, it was still dominated by the USA, and even today we can argue something like that because they implement a blockade against Cuba in 1961, 1962 to crush the chances to survive of the Cuban regime, and that made Castro's government to ally themselves with the Soviet Union. Also, you have the independence of many colonies in Africa and Asia. The example of Indochina is very interesting. It gained its liberation in 1954 through violent battles with the French army. Indochina after became Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And one college of Frantz Fanon, he said to him that, quote, "The war we fought together was child's play compared with what is going on there." End quote. The child's play, he refers to the fight against the Nazis, whereas what is going on there, the friend of Fanon refers to Indochina in 1930s, 1940s. He points how the French army was much more brutal against the people in Indochina, their natives there, than had been the Nazis against the French people. And this is absolutely crazy to hear this testimony, because we have been always told that the Nazis were the most evil in the earth. However, the liquidation, the torture, the systematic means to destroy the Indochina's resistance was, according to this Fanon's friend, even much worse, more violent. Obviously, in Indochina, you have the figure of Ho Chi Minh, which became an inspiration in the 1960s, because he was the leader of Indochina and later from the Vietnam resistance. So, this idea of violence to emancipate themselves, liberation struggle to reach freedom, it is a part of this idea of creating a mobilization to raise consciousness among the people, in which the people will acquire a new sense of agency. In that sense, Fanon said, quote, "Decolonization is always a violent phenomenon. It means replacing a certain species of man by another species of man," end quote. This is something that I was saying before. Decolonization, according to all the examples that Fanon examines in the book, has always been a struggle carried against the elites that came from another country, imposed their system, and had been benefiting economically from the exploitation of the natives. In that sense, Fanon said that, quote, "Decolonization is a program of complete disorder," end quote. In other words, a kind of strategy that have to be directed from the bottom up, not by some kind of leaders who will direct the means, but from the mass of people. In that sense, it is the encounter of two forces. It cannot be understood as neither a friendly understanding. It has been perpetrated by exploitation of the native by the settler. Thus, it is necessary for Fanon the use of violence to turn the scale, even though, as I mentioned earlier, the violence can be symbolic. In that sense, in his book, Fanon writes extensively about what he has seen in Algeria. He published in 1961 when the conflict was almost to an end. It was only 1 year before the end of the war and the independence of Algeria. But he describes perfectly what he saw in that area when Algeria was dominated by the French people. And he explained that the colonial world was a world divided into compartments. The divided line is guarded by barracks and police stations. For him, he described that they speak the language of pure force through the use of rifles and napalm, something similar that the US did in Vietnam and other colonizers have systematically implemented to diminish the resistance of the natives of a region, and also to put themselves as the masters of the area. In that sense, Frantz Fanon divides the colonial world in two symbolic towns, the settler town and the native town. On the one hand, the settler town is a well-fed town in which belly is always full of good things. On the other hand, the native town is a world without a space, a hungry town, a town on its knees, where the inhabitants have a look of lust and envy. And henceforth, there is no conciliation possible between the two sides. According to Fanon, the cause is the consequence. You are rich because you are white. You are white because you are rich. This is an idea of the class struggle in which Marx uses the idea of the bourgeoisie against the working class, and here Frantz Fanon established the first basis of this idea of being black and being white as a social construct which has delineated their whole lives since they are childs, being indoctrinated from different books and political impositions in which the black people are the evil, henceforth are the poor, whereas the white are the purer, they are rich, they have the means of production, they have built the better infrastructures, they live in a better world. It is no wonder why, according to Eric Hobsbawm, Frantz Fanon, this book, The Wretch of the Earth, was precisely an inspiration in the 1960s across the whole world, in the United States during the civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King against white supremacy in the country, but also during the students' movement in France, in Italy, in Germany, in other countries over the world, because the Frantz Fanon, it is one of the first political theories which speak openly against colonialism, not just as a system to impose a new structure in a country, but also how we can change the minds of people in order that they will under the yoke of the white population. The first one probably is Aimé Césaire, which it was also from Martinique as Frantz Fanon, and he always referenced him, especially in his work Black Skin, White Mask, as kind of his inspiration. And if I am not wrong, I think he met personally Aimé Césaire. So these are the current that later on it will be enhanced by many other people, many black people like Angela Davis. You have also Kwasi Appiah, Moore Gilbert. I mean, you have like a huge wave of political theorist philosophers that after 1950, 1960, with the decolonization process and the inspiration of Frantz Fanon, become more into these writings against colonialism. So, Frantz Fanon, he points how the colonial world is Manichaean, as the settler paints the native as a sort of quintessence of evil, to justify the colonization. In that sense, the native represents the absence and negation of values. This is very important because in order to normalize the exploitation against the native population, the settlers must create some ideas in which they will portray as the good people against those barbarians or savage that cannot think for themselves. And there is a book written by Mark Mathauer which is called The History of an Idea, in which he points how at the end of 19th century, after the scramble of Africa, during those years the Europeans intellectuals joined together in some conference in order to legitimize themselves against the colonization of the world, and he basically established some categories to define the different people outside of Europe. Those people were categorized depending on their origin. So, for example, the people from the Ottoman Empire or from India, they were categorized as barbarians because they thought that those people were able to think properly to create a new system, but still they had to be guided by the white people. Whereas the people in Africa, they were considered as savage, people who did not have even the knowledge or capacity to create a society. So all of this was written in some papers. It was the law at that time. It was created as a kind of hub of intellectuals in order to legitimize their conquest and the murdering perpetrated across the world. That worked perfectly well because it gave more legitimacy to the white people to enhance capitalism, colonialism, and imperialism, which are three currents that are interlinked clearly. And in that sense, the use of the religion was essential. How the church was imposed against the native myths, where the idea of going to the church, of praying God, following the Bible, was something seen as a kind of good in itself. But the myths developed by the native, their costumes, their stories that they were telling, it was considered as witchery, as something almost ridiculous. In that sense, with that note, I think I will finish here the episode. In the next one, I will keep talking about the growth of the earth, start with the intellectuals and elites, also the idea of neocolonialism, the attack that Frantz Fanon does against figures like Albert Camus or the president of Senegal, Senghor, which even though they supposedly were against colonialism, their attitude showed some ambivalence towards the end. And aside from that, I also will talk about Mireille Fanon, which is her daughter of Frantz Fanon, and develop further this idea of neocolonialism.